Think forward. Think Research Channel.
The opinions expressed in the following program are strictly those of the speaker. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation.
From the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. This is Frontier, discussions of today's most exciting research subjects by distinguished scientists and engineers working at the frontiers of knowledge.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to Water 2025, a roundtable on what is rapidly becoming one of our most precious and at times most contentious natural resources. We need water to drink, that's obvious. But water also profoundly affects our health, our economy, our food, and our energy production. Meanwhile, pressures and supplies are growing. Around the country, water is being withdrawn from aquifers faster than it's falling back to earth as rain. Plus, we're dealing with new classes of contaminants, aging infrastructure, and ramifications from global warming, more intense drought. Today, our panelists are going to address these challenges and also offer some prescriptions for how we can move toward a safer and more sustainable water supply. I'd like to briefly introduce them now. In the studio next to me, we have Pat Mulroy, who's the General Manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. We have Daniel Scheer, who's the President of Hydrologics. And we have Mark Helk, who's a Professor of Civil, Environmental, and Infrastructure Engineering at George Mason University. Joining us remotely are Mark Edwards, who's a Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Virginia Tech, and also Gerald Schnorr, who's a Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Iowa. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists a question, and then we're going to open it up. Dr. Schnorr, I'd actually like to start with you. It seems we've put a lot of effort and a lot of technology into predicting how much it might rain. Do we have the same tools to measure how long our water supplies might last?
Issue of monitoring our national water supplies. How much water do we have in reservoirs, in rivers, lakes, even in soil moisture, even in frozen water, our glaciers and snowpack, is really in its infancy. We don't have very good daily or hourly accounting of all the withdrawals and the inputs of water to the system. And that's one of the things that actually we're proposing we'd like to see more of, a waters network in the future. And National Science Foundation is helping us with plans to build a national water monitoring, observing, and forecasting network for both quantity and quality.
So the arid western states in particular have to deal with limited resources, and that same situation has become acrimonious in other areas of the country this year. So I'm wondering, how do neighboring states move forward in sharing this, what's becoming a very limited resource?
Well, you know, the 7 states in the Colorado River Basin faced that challenge since the big drought began in 2000. And we have the two main storage reservoirs are at 44% for Lake Powell and 50% for Lake Mead at this point, which is a pretty daunting set of realities. It was a very difficult process to go through. But I think it was a very learning experience for all of us to realize that if we worked together and we looked for solutions that protected the entire watershed and didn't try to become very myopic in what we saw as our mission, but saw it as protection of the entire Colorado River watershed and began to appreciate the strengths that our neighbors could give us through this cooperation, it made all the difference in the world. The agreements that we signed in December were historic. I mean, some have compared them in significance to the original compact. If the drought in the lower portion of the Colorado gets really bad, I know that ourselves as the urban area in Nevada, Southern California, and the Arizona cities know that only together, working as closely together as we possibly can, can we even provide a modicum of protection to our various constituencies?
Now, Dan Shear, there's a lot of end uses for water besides just drinking water. There's also the need for water for recreation and for protecting habitat for ecosystems and endangered species. In the end, I guess I'm wondering, is it possible to satisfy them all? Can you have recreation and have drinking water?
In most cases, in my experience, that's true. The most important fact to recognize is that water that falls and is held in reservoirs or falls and goes into streams can be used many times by many people before it flows to the sea or it evaporates. And by maximizing the use and reuse of that water, we certainly can do a much better job of maintaining environmental ecosystems while allowing urban users to use water and return most of it to the stream, while at the same time allowing agriculture to irrigate with water if they do so efficiently, and industries to use water either consumptively or return it to the stream. By maximizing the use of water and the timing of our releases so that perhaps we're using more water at times when we need it in stream for other uses as well, or maybe having a storage reservoir downstream so we can capture some of the surplus in a middle reach, we can do much better with the resources that we have. It's a question of operating as if everyone can get along. Same thing that Pat just said.
So that's on a level of sort of an overarching water management strategy. Mark Halk, I'm interested also in the engineering of the actual infrastructure. And I understand that engineering has changed a lot in the last 50 years. And how has that affected the way that we actually look at water infrastructure today?
All of the initial responses are right on point with that question, because you can only look at very broad issues, systems issues that Pat and Dan raised, if you have the tools to do that and you have the data. So Jerry's mention of we need more data is correct. The tools have evolved over the last 40 or 50 years, and they come in two primary forms. One is computation. We have computation ability now that we simply didn't have, so all of a sudden we can take advantage of that. The second thing that's happened is we have an entire branch of mathematics that is new, that allows us to develop tools to look at these much more complex system-wide problems. And you get the results that have been mentioned here with Nevada and elsewhere.
Mark Edwards, there's been a lot of emphasis on mainline pipeline infrastructure, and I'm wondering, how does the situation for individual homeowners compare? Should people be thinking about the water that actually takes it from their property line to their tap?
Absolutely. There are two key components to the water infrastructure system. There are the big pipes, the reservoirs that the utilities own. But once it gets to the property line, there's a infrastructure system, the pipes in your home, that is of equal value and complexity to operate. So many problems that actually occur in drinking water, including tastes and odors, lead in water, growth of harmful pathogens such as Legionella in water heaters, these are directly under the control of the consumer.
So is there a solution for, like, what can people actually do in their home? Do they have to replumb their pipes, or do they, is there some cheaper solution to actually protecting themselves?
Well, it depends on the type of the problem. The first step is to identify problems. For instance, if you're one of the unusual homes in this country that has a lead and water problem, for instance, you can buy a water filter certified to remove lead from the water to protect yourself and your family. On the water heater side of things, it's a little bit more complicated, because one way we control microbes in water heaters by turning the temperature up, and when we do that, we have increased energy costs, more scaling in the water heaters, and a greater risk of scalding. And right now, we really don't know how to counterbalance all those risks, and we're looking at that in great detail.
So Pat, I'm going to come back to you for a moment. I'm really interested in how sort of the public awareness part of the water problem. And I understand that's something that the Southern Nevada Water Authority has dealt with very effectively. Basically, how do you get the water users involved, aware that there's a problem, but then to take that next step and actually conserve water?
It's a very multifaceted public outreach campaign. And what we've learned over the last several years is that the public has to perceive that there is a good reason for them to make changes in their life. As insignificant as those may sound academically, they become very difficult for people to get past the inertia and actually do something. The drought was the catalyst, and so as ugly as the drought was, it gave us an opportunity to make some real permanent changes. We use 70% of our water outside. Anything that's used inside is recycled. We're one of the few, if not the only city in the United States that has 100% reuse. So our focus where we garner additional resources is outside. We embarked on a program to begin paying our customer to take grass out. And we've spent now almost $100 million reimbursing our customers for taking out their grass and replanting and putting in desert landscaping. The visual of Lake Mead was very helpful. That coupled with a real profound ad campaign with targeted audiences and in the various areas and awareness outreach with our youth. And we opened in Southern Nevada a new Central Park, which is all dedicated to sustainable living in the desert and looking forward to what does Las Vegas look like in a sustainable world. And water conservation is a key component of that. And so the kids are starting to pick it up, and the kids are your best messengers. The older generation, like myself, they're sometimes a little harder to move. But I think the community came together in a very profound way, and it's become a real cultural conversion in Southern Nevada, more than a drought event. Because everything we've done is now permanent, whether it's the turf removal, whether it's the rate structure changes, whether it's watering schedules, whether it's putting golf courses on water budgets, whether putting covers on your pools. There is a new heightened level of awareness around water in Southern Nevada.
And you've gotten there partly by targeting, doing the market research to figure out who you need to send that message to.
And it's usually the male population between 25 and 45, as we've come to discover. They're in charge of the sprinkler clock. And they usually went and they found it once and they adjusted it and then they piled boxes in front of it.
So where did your advertisements play?
We hit every sports channel. In fact, one of the ads that our team put together with our ad agency, R&R Advertising, just won an Effie Award. We have this cute little old lady, walks up to a door, rings the doorbell. The water guy's got his sprinkler going on the wrong day. The water's running off his property onto the street. And she kicks him in a very uncomfortable place for males and merrily walks off the property. They got the message.
That sounds effective. Yeah.
And then the tagline was, "Don't make us ask you again."
So I'm curious, from the rest of our panelists, do you feel like there's a similar, maybe not exactly the same, but a similar public awareness effort that needs to go on in terms of other areas of water use or home water infrastructure? Yes, by all means.
We've managed to help a number of clients resolve very difficult water issues. And the most important thing when you bring people together and get them talking about water issues is to make it clear that, one, it's what benefits they get out of the water are the most important thing, not how much water they get. And that's a really big thing. So usually we will focus on producing displays which allow us to demonstrate to people what it is they get in their own terms. They design the displays, we just produce them. We look at different ways of managing the water and we produce their displays. It is true that once you have developed these displays and people understand what it is they're really trying to achieve for themselves, and also that what other people are trying to achieve for themselves is also legitimate, these issues and the way to manage water becomes much more clear, and it's possible to get agreements on what to do.
Jerry Schnoor, I'd like to actually come back to you for a minute. I feel like there's been a lot of media this year on sort of the other end of water, which is contaminants. There was a big AP report on things like pharmaceuticals being in the nation's water supplies. And I guess my question for you is, do you feel like the public's concerns are in line with what scientists' top concerns are? And how big a problem are these new contaminants anyway?
I think, Jennifer, the verdict is still out on some of the contaminants because they're so new and the measurements are very, very low. Some places it's quantity, like in southern Nevada, but some places it's quality as well. And certainly agriculture has a big impact on our water quality throughout the nation. For example, in Des Moines, they use the Raccoon River as a source of drinking water supply. And the nitrate levels from fertilizers on agriculture has continued to go up such that they have to actually remove nitrate in order to use the entire river as a water supply. So there's many, many issues confronting our water, both quantity and quality throughout the country.
Jennifer, can I jump in on that
Absolutely.
pharmaceutical issue for a second as a water agency that has to deal with these all the time? And water quality is just as much a concern in southern Nevada as water quantity is, because as Lake Mead shrinks, the contaminant levels concentrate. And the frustration for all of us in the water industry, and I know there was a lot that was said about industry not being willing to come forward and admit that it was there. In a vacuum, when we don't know what the relative, we're now measuring these in trillions,
Yes.
Parts per trillion, which is infinitesimal. To give you, put it in perspective, a part per trillion is a half an inch of the distance between here and the moon, if you were to put it in distance measurement. Or to put it in time measurement, it's a second in 750 years. So you're talking about something that is absolutely infinitesimal. And when that data comes out in a vacuum, when we don't know what is the relative effect on human health, the fact that pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors, which is a fancy name for everything from coffee to Coca-Cola to you name it, and it's an endocrine disruptor, and it's an environmental issue. But what the effect on human health is, we don't know. So people hear that it's there. They don't understand what a part per trillionth means, and instantly they become afraid. So how that information is out there, I mean, we put it on the internet. We're not hiding from this at all, and we've spent tens of millions of dollars around doing the science around pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors. But what needs to happen is that a standard needs to be set. We need to invest as a country. I mean, so far the water industry has been the one that's been investing in all the research around pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors. But I think the Environmental Protection Agency and the health agencies need to collaborate on science to find out what is harmful and what is totally insignificant. Because before we build even more sophisticated treatment that uses even more energy in an era where we're all looking at what our relative aggregate impact is on the planet in terms of our energy use, we need to be sure that we're not treating for something that doesn't need to be treated for.
We have a communications problem that seems to be triggered by things like a Washington Post article on endocrine disruptors, which may or may not be a valid concern, or a picture of Lake Mead at an incredibly low level. But most of the country doesn't have these things that are going on. So most people, when they wake up in the morning, are not thinking that if they turn on the tap, nothing will come out or that they can't drink it. Most people are very satisfied with their water supplies, and they don't take it into account. They don't think about it at all, which is also a problem because we have an aging infrastructure. There are problems that have been long-term, that have existed for a very long time, that we continue to have to deal with. But there are these new potential contaminant problems that may be an issue or not. And we also have quantity issues that may be apparent. There are risks associated with that, and we have a problem communicating with society to get those resolved in a coherent fashion. And there are a couple of things that have happened. One is the threats to water supplies and wastewater systems have changed, in particular because while we're incredibly good at dealing with all of the so-called random things, a drought, a flood, an earthquake, a volcano, an accident, a pump dies, we're not very good at organized outsiders trying to disrupt things. And we're spending a lot of money trying to protect wide open systems or fairly open systems against threats that didn't used to exist. And it's very difficult to do. And we're not doing a very good job of communicating that problem either. So the communication, I think, is a big deal. And if we can solve that, then we can get all the right people at the table. And we have the tools and we have the people who can help to resolve them.
So how does water infrastructure compare to other kinds of infrastructure in this sort of post-9/11 age of vulnerability when we're analyzing our systems?
Basically, the water systems are doing a good job. And the wastewater systems are doing a good job. And there's lots of details you could go through. In 2003, all water suppliers were required to conduct a vulnerability assessment. And then they responded to that, and they took care of obvious problems. But there are ongoing issues of how do you address risks that you don't know about. So the water industry has actually been at the forefront of developing a risk assessment methodology that would focus not just on organized outsiders, terrorists, but also on all the rest of the threats that we face. So that you balance, you can figure out how would you spend money to get the most bang for the buck. And that's a very difficult question because these systems are very large, they're complex, they involve the society in ways that other systems don't.
So Mark Edwards, I'm going to go back to you for a moment. I understand that trying to treat water, perhaps for some of these new contaminants, actually affects the water infrastructure itself. Can you talk a little bit about the corrosivity of pipelines and how those two things are interrelated?
Yes, in grappling with these emerging infrastructure issues, there are always unintended consequences. So when we change, for instance, the way in which we treat the water to make it cleaner according to existing knowledge, such as changing disinfectants from chlorine to chloramine, we sometimes cause another problem that we never expected, such as increased lead leaching in consumers' homes. Another classic trade-off that's emerging is as we do a better job conserving water in homes, the water sits in your home plumbing longer. And just like milk can go bad as it sits around, to some extent water can go bad too. And what we're finding is as we increase conservation, we have more problems arising from tastes and odors and bacteria in consumers' homes. So we almost have to change our way of designing our home plumbing system, building plumbing systems, to be compatible with more sustainable, lower water use features. But one thing you can be sure of is that as we strive to improve the quality of water further, we will create other problems that we never thought of, and we're going to have to deal with those as they arise.
Would anyone else like to address that sort of fundamental conflict between water conservation, perhaps, and water quality?
Well, I can understand what he's saying. I mean, if water sits stagnant for a long time, for example, any of us that have a surface water supply as our principal source that has organics in it, simply by adding disinfectants to it, you create byproducts, which have been shown to be carcinogenic. So the water, for example, in our reservoirs, our water has to circulate through within 72 hours. So we very carefully balance how much we put in. We know our customers. We know seasonally what the drawdown in those reservoirs is going to be, but we have to be ever aware of it. There are whole new programs, computer programs out there that very much balance energy use and water quality in order to give you that intricate balance between not allowing your water to go stagnant and using as little energy as you possibly can in the delivery of that water supply. It's not getting easier, it's getting more complicated.
There are other trade-offs as well. If you think about a situation where you have a drought and you ask everybody to conserve water, then the amount of water that you're delivering to everybody's home is less than it used to be. Well, your bill is a function of how much water you use, typically, which means that the amount of revenue coming into the water company drops at precisely the time that they may need more money to take care of problems associated with a lack of water. So you have, unless the water system is set up to cushion that, you can have severe problems.
It comes down to a question of knowing what you're managing for. And in many cases in this country, We don't know the answer to that pretty obvious question to ask. The answer is often not very obvious. I can recount a case in London in the late 70s. There was a severe drought. And the Thames Water Authority told everyone in the basin to conserve water. They were taking water from reservoirs that were off-stream, using it, putting it in the Thames. It was coming down to London and being used. As soon as everyone in the basin began to conserve water, London ran out. It is very important to realize that everything is connected, and when you institute management schemes, you have to look at all of your management objectives. One of the real problems we have in this country is that no one sets those objectives. For example, the Corps of Engineers gives very broad guidelines to the Congress gives very broad guidelines to the Corps of Engineers in managing reservoirs, not sufficiently detailed so that the Corps itself can know what it's managing for. So the Corps puts in place some operating scheme, no other guidance from the Congress, and that becomes the status quo. Try and change that status quo, and you're up against the wall. For well over 25 years, the Corps has been trying to write a new operating scheme for the Missouri. They can't get it done because no one will let the status quo change. And if we can't change the status quo in water management in this country, we can't progress. We will run out of water. We will cost ourselves enormously in terms of the benefits that we can get from water and in terms of how we treat the environment and in terms of how our economy develops.
And just to add to that, I mean, moving forward into this century, it is going to be, I've got to pick up right on where Dan left off. The inability of communities, of governments, and of water institutions to recognize that everything they've taken for granted in the past has changed. There are all of the givens that they used to believe in, they can just throw them away. And that the future is about adapting, and adapting as quickly as you can, making course corrections, not trying to say, I'm going to enter into an agreement or set up a resource plan today that will last me into perpetuity. Perpetuity doesn't exist, and it's going to have to change and be tweaked all along the way. So this need to replace this rigidity that we've lived in with flexibility is the key for this country to continue to be able to be as oblivious to its water supply as, quite frankly, they are in most instances.
I think we have a question from the audience. Jim?
Yes, this is Jim Meggs, Editor-in-Chief of Popular Mechanics. I'm intrigued by the paradox that water utilities face, that when there's a drought and usage declines, their revenue declines. In most markets, when there's a shortage of something, the price goes up. And I'm intrigued by the question of the consensus that we are facing long-term water shortages, running out of water. Should we face the challenging thought that most of us just aren't paying anywhere near what the water we use is actually worth?
We've got to be careful with that because, you know, it may not be my chosen lifestyle, but I can live without energy. I can live without natural gas. I mean, I can physically survive. Humans cannot physically survive without water. And so water becomes a very different, and I hate the word commodity. It's not really a commodity, it's a resource. And it's a life essential resource. And what happens on your pricing question is we have these tiered rate structures. What industry makes a profit by dissuading their customers from buying the product that they sell? I mean, we put every incentive in our pricing structure to dissuade you from buying it. Obviously, that's going to have a financial impact. And so you have to move forward cautiously, and you have to have some equalizers in there that cover your base cost while putting those incentives in different pricing brackets. And it's an art, not a science, and it changes community to community.
I think you also have to realize that unlike oil or things that are privately held, water is publicly owned in this country. It goes back to merry old England, where the king owned all the water, and now the states, not the federal government, but the states, owns the water in each state. Most water companies are not allowed to make a profit on selling water. They may make a profit on the services, but not on selling water. And it is true that the cost of water in other public uses goes up as water becomes more short. And therefore we have the kinds of increasing rate structures. The more you buy, the more you pay for it per unit that Pat talked about. And from the standpoint of maximizing the use of water in a public context, that's right. But it does lead to the perverse implication that you raised, which is that when it's short, revenue goes down. We need pricing structures that are smart enough to account for that.
From James Mendenhall, he's asking, should we not be attempting to capture the increasing amount of fresh water being lost from melting glaciers or polar ice for water storage use? So I guess the question is, do we turn global warming to our advantage in terms of supplies? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I think I can take a stab at that. Mm-hmm. We are already, in fact, benefiting from the glacier melt worldwide. Communities have increased stream flow. It occurs earlier in the year than it used to. But of course, we worry about a great reckoning that eventually the glacial ice will be gone, and these communities will have no longer a water resource. So that's one of the big concerns about a changing climate, and we are losing glacial ice worldwide.
Okay, and from the audience?
Hi. Yeah. Many countries in the world pay much more attention to water than the U.S. because they've had much worse problems. I've seen statistics that wars breaking out correlate with problems of water shortage, and of course food production is an issue. In that context, a friend of mine does water policy for the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And I asked him, what is the impact of energy overall on water? If you had an inexpensive, renewable source of energy available everywhere in China, would that make it possible for you to solve your otherwise intractable dilemmas? He quickly said yes, but he didn't give me more details. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about the strength and the nature of the connection and what we should do about it.
There is a tremendous connection between water and energy. It takes very large amounts of water in most instances to cool the power plants, be they nuclear or be they coal. There's now some air-cooled gas power plant technology that only uses a de minimis amount of water that's being used in Nevada, for example. And on the flip side, it takes enormous amounts of energy, not just to desalt ocean water, but to treat it to the safe drinking water standard. I mean, we ozonate all the water that comes into southern Nevada. Huge energy user. And all the pumping costs associated with it. So if there was an inexpensive, renewable source, if you will, one that doesn't add to the global warming phenomenon, then it would be of great benefit to us as long as it is not hugely water intensive itself. Therein lies the secret.
Another way to address the question, it's not water that's short. The world is covered with oceans. It's fresh water that's short. And with energy, you can create fresh water from salt water. Given enough energy, you have no water problem. Almost a priori, not only can you desalt it, but you can pump it anywhere you want. That's not going to happen in the immediate future. So the question is, how do we trade off between water and energy? And there are a lot of trade-offs that do occur. For example, there is hydropower generation that uses water stored in reservoirs to generate hydropower. A great way to make more water available is to make sure that you schedule the hydropower so that it occurs when people need the water downstream. If you do that with minimal losses in hydropower, the value of the power produced, because you have to be smart about how you're doing this, you can have the water too. But if you don't do it, then you get a little more value in power and no water. And it's a very, very good way to look at how you do things.
Dr. Schnorr, go ahead.
Jennifer, along those lines, it takes water to make energy also, as Patricia said, and we have a national goal right now, the energy bill of 2007, to make 36 billion gallons by 2022 of biofuels. And so in the Midwest and actually throughout a good portion of the country, we're worried about the water required to implement that goal. It takes a lot of water, especially if you're irrigating corn for ethanol, for example, but also water at the actual production facilities. So our energy needs relate to our increasing water shortages as well.
Everybody's answered the question at a very large scale. I'd like to reduce it to a tiny one. There are interdependencies between almost all of our infrastructure systems. So a classic case in the Washington, D.C. area was in 2003, a tropical storm came through, but associated with that was some other things that went on. And it's sort of like the butterfly effect where, this is not entirely true, but a branch fell on a wire in Ohio, and there was a cascading failure of the electric network that resulted in the Mid-Atlantic being without energy for a relatively short period of time. Water treatment plants in Northern Virginia lost power for about 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours, something like that. Well, without energy, you can't treat the water and you can't pump it around. So the result of this outage was that a notice went out for health effects. Everybody has to boil their water. And the other thing that happened was the amount of water available for other users went down. So all of a sudden, the emergency response system suffered. Hospitals were close to turning away patients, not because they didn't have water for people to drink, but because they simply couldn't do laundry. They couldn't clean sheets. And so they didn't have a bed that was clean to put a new patient in. There were buildings in the area that have, closed windows that you can't open. Well, you need water to purify the air and to circulate it in those buildings. Well, air quality degrades over time, and they were getting close to having to get out. Turns out that the gas company thought that the water supply was so reliable that they used the water supply to cool their pumps. Well, without the water supply, the second energy source in the region was close to going down. And all of these cascading effects within infrastructure systems and across were not necessarily known ahead of time to the upstream infrastructure system. They didn't know who their critical customers were. They thought they knew, but people acted independently, and it's that system effect across infrastructure systems that can get you.
And a final note on ocean desalt, it is an unbelievable resource, but it doesn't come without its set of environmental consequences.
It's true.
And it depends on the magnitude of the desalting effort. You've got to put the brine somewhere. And what happens when you start brine loading the oceans? I mean, they look enormous to us now, but where you put it and how the current's distributed and how it moves around is incredibly important to the ecosystem. And we can't solve one problem at the expense of another.
Mark Edwards, actually, perhaps this is one that you could address. C. Johns is asking that, given that the majority of water is actually used for non-potable uses, such as irrigation of lawns, etc., what's your opinion in respect to treating lower quality water for those uses and then maybe providing consumers with point-of-use devices in order to supply them with potable water?
Well, that's something that's going to have to be increasingly looked at. As the viewer correctly mentioned, the typical water use per person for drinking and cooking is just a tiny fraction of the total, on the order of, say, 2 or 3 liters per day. And in many parts of the countries, it makes economic sense to use point-of-use devices, pitcher-type filters or end-of-faucet or in-home devices to remove contaminants just for that small volume of water used for cooking and drinking, as opposed to treating every drop to that same standard. So in green building, for instance, more and more folks are incorporating gray water recycling, cistern collection to flush toilets, and we're going to see more and more emphasis on lower volumes of higher quality water, and that might indeed mean more use of home treatment devices, which has its own set of problems because the homeowner has to maintain those, pay for those themselves.
And Dr. Schnorr, we actually have a follow-up to your comment on biofuels, and that is from someone in Oklahoma, Bijo Matthew, who wants to know what your, basically, are there types of biofuels that would be perhaps more compatible with water use in the future, perhaps non-irrigated crops or other forms?
Certainly, non-irrigated crops is one of the ways to go, but most people think the second generation of biofuels that will take us to this 36 billion gallon a year national goal will be from cellulosic sources, so woody plants or miscanthus or switchgrass, maybe even prairie polyculture, replanting the prairies. It's generally suspected that these will use less water. They'll be much kinder to the environment, hold soil in place, require fewer pesticides and nutrients, and be a much better solution to the problem. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. We still probably need some improvements in technology in order to have second generation cellulosic ethanol. So for at the time being, we're producing it from corn and from soybeans, and some of that is irrigated, and production facilities do require high purity water.
We have one more question from Jason Curl, and he's asking if someone can speak to the trade-off between treating drinking water to remove micropollutants versus treating wastewater and having source water protection to remove the micropollutants from the system?
That's a valid point. And I'll tell you what probably for me is the most compelling. It's not that the technology is not there. In fact, we employ it to polish that water and treat that water to virtually distilled level if we wanted to before we bring it into our customers' homes. The issue is how much of these contaminants can the rest of the environment sustain? For example, the whole issue of endocrine disruptors is manifesting itself first in fish rather than manifest itself in human beings. It's first an environmental issue. And, you know, to have what we want at the least cost to sacrifice the rest of the ecosystem makes little sense to me. So there is a balance that needs to be struck, and there needs to be a high degree of treatment before we put it back in the environment, especially in areas where those reservoirs or lakes are shrinking because of drought, because of that whole issue of, you know, the less the water supply, the less dilution there is, and the more concentrations you have of the contaminants.
Mm-hmm. I would love to ask a little bit more actually about the water, the National Network for Monitoring Water that is being developed, and actually find out what the plans are for perhaps using that experimentally to find out what the ramifications are of different policies. Dr. Schnorr, could you take that?
Jennifer, the Waters Network is a plan to try to use real-time sensors and breakthroughs in wireless technology and high-performance computing to give us a heads up on our water, both the quantity of water throughout the nation and the quality of water. But it really is still just a dream in the planning stages that we do have new sensors which can look for things like harmful algal blooms, look for pathogens coming down rivers towards water supply so that we could change our drinking water source, and also we could monitor better protection, source water protection that you mentioned earlier. We think this is the way to go, the use of modern technologies, real time for forecasting our water quality and quantity. But at this point in time, it's still a dream, one that we're trying to construct through the National Science Foundation.
And if I may, it is a dream, and it's very difficult to implement. And I think that it's time that for those who are against it, the game is up. water monitoring budgets are the first thing cut in budgetary cycles. They are, and in part it's because people don't want to know. What Pat and I and Mark and I and everyone on this panel has been talking about is adaptive management. If you don't know what's out there, you can't adapt to it. We don't have enough water data. We need more water data. It's a bad idea not to know. Go tell your congressman.
Well, and as a follow-up note, there are 8 of us, the larger utilities in the United States, that have banded together as a climate change action committee, and the single most, the loudest message that we are delivering to Congress is that it's time to really take the issue of climate change out of the closet, and there is a massive amount of science that needs to go in to taking those global climate models, making them more useful at a regional level, and giving us some tools with which to have more data than we have right now. That nexus between climate and precipitation and how it's going to manifest itself is enormous. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast, whether it's flooding or whether it's drought. There are impacts that are going to be felt, and we have to invest in it. Or we're going to sit there one day and we're going to look back and say, oh my God, why didn't we?
Yeah, we really haven't talked that much about the problem of not just drought, but surface runoff, for instance, and the effect that that might have on our wastewater treatment systems, particularly with global warming, which experts predict may cause heavier rainfalls rather than rainfall distributed over periods of time. Dr. Hauck, could you perhaps speak to what effect that may have, whether we should be anticipating 500-year storms versus 100-year storms, for instance?
I think it's geographically highly variable. So Pat's notion of we need regional information as opposed to global information is right on point, because the response is going to be totally different if you decide that the climate change is going to be, you're going to have much more intense, short duration storms as opposed to ones that are spread out more and less intense. And we're going to see all different kinds of changes. So you need to know what kind of change you're going to see and where you're going to see it so that you can adapt locally. And we need to get there, and it's going to be a hard thing to do. It's not easy to model the global climate change and make grand pronouncements. It's much more difficult to be specific and sure that you're actually going to see those kinds of changes locally. But my experience has been that the water industry specifically is an incredibly talented bunch of people. And when they know what the problem is, they can respond quickly. There are cases where, in particular up near the Great Lakes, where one way to accommodate global climate change was to make the determination that in particular studies that the 100-year storm, that storm that occurs with a probability of 0.01 in any 1 year or once approximately every 100 years, that happens now is going to be not that, but instead is going to be what we currently call the 500-year storm. So all of a sudden, something that is really rare, once every 500 years, is going to become more normal. And since most of our design standards for lots of things depend on 100-year events instead of 500, well, we have to redesign all kinds of things. We have to redesign bridges. Mm-hmm. We have to redesign, I mean, it's not just water and water supplies and reservoirs and piping systems. It's other infrastructure.
Actually, we'll take one more question from the audience. Jerry?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jerry Bales from Popular Mechanics. There's a lot of development going on in the country in which we're not having households hooked up to the municipal sewer system, but to septic systems, and a lot of people using well water because the infrastructure is just not being put into place. And I'm wondering to what extent that's sort of a wild card, because of course that water use affects the rest of the country as well, but it's not really under the control in the same way of larger utilities or municipal systems. Is that a factor that we have to consider both for health and for the water resources that we have going forward?
In the West, it's governed and regulated by the states. They have very strict water right regulations. They can tell you how much is being pumped out of the ground, and they very carefully monitor water quality. You have areas where you and I would probably say they have way too many septic systems. Those are being looked at very carefully to municipalize those, because now you've got a concentration of people large enough to where we have to do something about it. But I think your point is well taken. It is a potential source of contamination, both from the well side and from the septic side, and it is one that, when we talk about water supply in this country, we often don't even recognize is out there.
And Mark Edwards, I think you wanted to address this as well.
Yeah, there's approximately 16 million Americans who get their water from wells, and I happen to be one of them. And as a homeowner operating the system, you are essentially your own water supply. You are 100% responsible for the quality of water to the tap, and that includes everything from microbiological purity to lead and copper. And so this is an issue that's to some extent falling off the radar screen, because most of our public education materials are directed to municipal users, and we have to do a better job of addressing that and publicizing these problems.
So I think what I'm going to do is open it up to you all if you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with that we didn't touch on yet today.
The most important thing, I think, for future of water in the country, as opposed to individual systems, is for the United States and each of the states. Remember, each of the states owns the water in its own state, to decide what that water is being managed for and determine objectives in ways that people can evaluate whether or not particular alternatives for managing that water are meeting those objectives. They don't have to tell us exactly how to trade off everything. Stakeholders in individual communities can get together and figure out how they want to trade off those things. But we need a set of management objectives that we can evaluate, that we can trade off one against the other. We don't need vague dictates that this will be managed for hydropower, recreation, and water supply. Doesn't work. There are environmental concerns that have been added later. How do we measure those? How do we measure hydropower? How do we measure recreation? How do we measure water supply reliability, water supply quality? What are we trying to manage for? If we can figure that out, there's plenty of talent in this industry to make sure that it actually happens.
I think there's also a fundamental paradigm shift, to add on to what Dan was saying, that has to occur and is beginning to occur as a result of the discussions around climate change. I mean, it used to be that we as the water utility would just take care of everybody's problems. It's a two-way street. The United States, at a very individual, residential, homeowner, apartment dweller level, needs to become better aware and take responsibility for their part of the water picture. We are the most voracious users of natural resources anywhere in the world. And you can't help but feel that we've treated our water systems as our throwaway utilities. They're the ones we don't think about. It's not the largest bill that comes into the house. It's not the one that, you know, we are so concerned over, because for the most part, we have been incredibly fortunate. We haven't lived in a country where a child dies every second from a waterborne disease. But we have to stop neglecting it. I think the challenges that water quality as a result of climate change or as a result of better science is going to bring us, or our actual water supply, are going to become overwhelming. And we have to begin that conversation with our public, because they are a part of the solution. We can't fix it for them anymore.
It's easy for me to say because I'm in the research business, but we need more research. We need answers to lots and lots of problems at the individual homeowner, their individual well level, up through the kinds of things that Dan was talking about, entire regions, basins in the Missouri River. And we have the opportunity to do that. We need more data, we need more research, we need better tools, because if we don't, we're going to be short of water that is drinkable, that is available to grow crops, and it's a fundamental thing. It's not like we're a little short of electricity.
I'm a little curious as well, since we happen to have 3 people on the panel who actually are researchers at universities, and then someone from an independent company, and then someone from a water authority. These are 3 very sort of different, powerful roles in our water future. And how should we be working together in order to get to where we need to be? Do they happen on parallel tracks, or is it something that more conversation needs to be taking place?
I think we do work together.
Great.
I know these people. I think they know us. I work with water companies all the time, and I think other people do too.
Okay.
Dan does.
I agree with Mark Houck about research, of course, being from a university, but I also might add that in the course of working together, I'm reminded by the name of our program, Water in 2025, that the American Society of Civil Engineers says that we will have a $1 trillion shortfall in our infrastructure and infrastructure repairs by that same year, 2025. So that in addition to greater research, which helps us to understand how to do it more wisely and how to do it smarter, we do need the agreement of Congress and the people of the United States that our infrastructure has fallen sorely behind and is in very bad need of repair.
And Dr. Edwards, did you have any final thoughts?
By and large, this is a great profession. Every now and then we have some disagreements about how resources have been allocated, but in general I have found all groups come to the table, sit down and resolve these problems, and even for areas that I've advocated that I've thought were overlooked, we've responded in remarkably fast fashion to address those issues. So I think we'll continue to do so in the future.
Great. Well, I would like very much to thank our panelists for joining us and to thank everyone who's tuned in online and our live audience. This has been a really interesting conversation, and of course one that's going to continue far into the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.